And we're now live.
Hi, everybody. Hello and welcome. Welcome to everybody in the room and online. We have about 400 registered people online, which is amazing. And also all of you here. It's not surprising given the engaging program lined up for you and this terrific book that is going to be launched today. And also a great introduction and to the book from author Ian Scoones. I'm Laila Mehta. I'm a professorial fellow here at IDS in the Resource Politics and Environmental Change Cluster, and I'm today's chair and discussant. So today's event will celebrate the UK launch of Navigating Uncertainty, Radical Rethinking for a Turbulent World, written by Professor Ian Scoones. There's going to be several other events that follow across Europe, so it's great that we're here at the first one. And then it'll be followed by an exhibition of Uncertain Worlds and also drinks where you can chat informally with Ian and others. So please stay back if you're here online in the room. This book is really pretty extraordinary. I've spent the last few days reading it, and it's written by an outstanding scholar. It reveals to us that uncertainties are everywhere, from climate change to pandemics and financial markets. And navigating uncertainty, that is where we cannot predict what may happen, is essential. So the book argues that current approaches based on risk, control, and quantification have failed really badly. And instead, we need to navigate uncertainties in new ways that embrace iterative learning, flexibility, care, and hope. And there is no better person in the world to make these arguments than Ian. Ian's work draws on about 40 years of research and engagement on agrarian and environmental change and pastoralism in different parts of Africa and beyond, especially also in Zimbabwe, a place he writes on regularly and returns to regularly. Ian is a professorial fellow in the Resource Politics and Environmental Cluster at IDS. He was co-director of the ESRC STEP Center. A lot of this book draws on insights, and indeed a lot of people here in the room are from that era, but also beyond. And he also led the ERC Advanced Grant Project Pastorus, and that exhibition there is based on this project, Pastoralism, Uncertainty, and Resilience. Ian won the 2019 Esther Bosra Prize for Research on Development and is also a member of the editorial collective of the Journal of Peasant Studies, where he and many other members of the collective have authored key publications and also convened high-profile events around resource grabbing and agrarian politics. So I looked at the website today, Ian's website, and he has authored or edited or co-authored or co-edited over 20 books, which is really amazing. But I hope you agree after today's event that I think this book, Navigating Uncertainty, is not only an exciting addition to his work, but a great culmination of his research efforts and engagements on the ground. So I don't want to come in the way of Ian's talk, and I'll also provide some brief comments later. So handing over to you now to outline the journey of this book and also some of its key messages.
Thank you very much, Laila. These introductions make me sound incredibly old, which is also true. I want to introduce this book and make the argument of the book, which is, as Laila said, if we put uncertainty at the center of our thinking and practice, this means a really fundamental rethinking of society, of economy, politics and policy as we know it. And as I'll show, for a number of reasons, we're stuck. We're stuck in a rather linear, mechanistic, technocratic, and risk-based paradigm that often fails to address dynamic complexity in today's turbulent world. And this, I argue, is problematic and indeed actually sometimes dangerous. So I want to draw on this book that's now out with Polity Press, with the title, as Laila said, Navigating Uncertainty, Radical Rethinking for a Turbulent World. So we're just getting the screen sorted.
Okay.
So uncertainties are indeed everywhere, as we all know. And as Helga Novotny described in her book, uncertainties are indeed written into the script of life. Bruno Latour argued that the world is not a solid continent of sprinkled by a few lakes of uncertainties, but a vast ocean of uncertainties speckled by a few islands of calibrated and stabilized forms. So what if the world is dominated by uncertainty and complexity, not just risk and stability? What if the modernist systems of formalized planning, risk management, control systems, and so on just don't work? I'm going to argue that this is the case, but I'm also going to argue that all is not lost, that there are some people who have long grappled with uncertainty that we can all learn from. So my reflections come from a project that Lila mentioned, Pastres, which was an ERC advanced grant, Pastoralism, Uncertainty, and Resilience, Global Lessons from the Margins. And over 6 years, we explored how pastoralists, mobile, extensive livestock keepers have been navigating uncertainties in 6 sites across 3 continents. So in the book, I draw quite a lot on these reflections from this research, but also from other work by myself and indeed others from small-scale farming in Zimbabwe, from farmers and fishers in the Sundarbans Delta, from control room technicians in California, from bankers in London and New York, from food consumers in Brazil and India, and frontline health workers in the UK and Southern Africa. Why are all these people and all these contexts similar, you ask? Well, that's what I will come to in this presentation. The argument basically is that we must learn from those who must navigate uncertainties continuously. Climate, markets, disease, conflicts, political conditions, and so on. All of those situations require continuously confronting uncertainties. Now, a core framework of the book that some people close to the front row will know about comes from the work of Andy Sterling, who's here in the audience, and draws indeed on work from a long period of time by Brian Wynne, who's also in the audience. So credit to them for coming up with some of these ideas way back in the last century. Ouch. So originally from the 1990s, but developed through the work in the STEP Centre, this framework really, I think, helps us think about how risk and uncertainty and other forms of incertitude are related. So the framework basically, for those of you who haven't seen it before, explores 2 axes: knowledge about the likelihoods of outcomes and knowledge about outcomes themselves, and therefore explores and uncovers 4 dimensions of incertitude. First, risk, where the probabilities of both outcomes and likelihoods are known or can be predicted. Second, uncertainty, where likelihoods are unknown, even though we know about the potential outcomes. Third, ambiguities, where outcomes are contested. So here, fairness, questions of fairness, justice, distribution, who wins, who loses are all in the frame. And finally, ignorance, where we don't know what we don't know. So conditions of uncertainty, ambiguity, ignorance, not risk, are, I would argue, by far the most common situations we encounter in policy and practice. And they're not amenable to simple risk management. So what happens when we close down to risk? That's the top left-hand corner. This is conditioned by all sorts of politics and processes of power and institutional relationships, what Michel Foucault called governmentalities. And the examples from this slide come from livestock situations, from pastoral development and drought responses, but you could choose any other area that you work on. So plans, models, insurance products, goals, targets, metrics, indicators, all seek closure, pushing us dangerously often into zones where knowledge and outcomes are assumed to be known, or at least thought to be able to be estimated, predicted, or calculated. So why is this a problem? So in the book and across the chapters, I look at how, if you like, closing down to risk in that top left-hand corner is problematic, and opening up to uncertainty across a number of themes is essential. And I explore this across these chapters, the implications for policy and practice. And I look at contrasting cases from all over the world, some of which I've mentioned, where learning lessons from the margins, learning lessons from practice become really important in thinking about how to navigate uncertainty. I can't summarize all the arguments in the book in full, you'll have to read it, but let me give you a very brief tour of these chapters and give you a sense of what they contain. So there's a chapter on markets, banking and finance. And I look particularly, obviously, at the 2007-8 financial crash and how particular models, notably the Black-Scholes-Merton equation and the regulatory practices around the various Basel Accords, created, in many senses, a false sense of security through the practices of organized risk management, when in fact it was uncertainty and ignorance that prevailed. Many people knew this. The then chief economist of the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, commented in 2009, processes of securitization resulted in the network becoming more complex, more dense and opaque, with diversification generating heightened system-wide uncertainties. The result, of course, was the crash. And the crisis, he argues, was rooted in an exaggerated sense of knowledge and control. So he was chief economist at the Bank of England, very close to this process. Also, reflections after the event by anthropologists and others working in the finance system show that things could have been much worse. Things weren't as bad as they could have been because traders and others in the financial network were able to navigate compounding and cascading uncertainties in real time. It was what I argue is the human touch, the socialized networks that were important in learning, adaptation, and response. In the same chapter, I also look at very different market settings, but actually with remarkably similar characteristics. They're global, they're highly interconnected, they involve rapid transactions, they involve informal and tacit knowledge. And these are the livestock markets of the Horn of Africa, Western India, Southern Europe, and elsewhere. And I ask, how did they retain reliability? The answer actually is the same. It's a socially embedded network which can respond to uncertainties and help steer away from ignorance. In sum, understanding the social basis of markets and indeed financial systems is crucial if we're to avoid the real dangers of closing down to risk and instead embrace uncertainties. The second chapter looks at the regulation of new technologies, where questions are often asked, what is safe for whom during policy and regulatory discussions? I look at a range of different technologies, artificial intelligence, driverless cars, energy systems, and so on. But I focus especially on the debate about GM crops in the late 1990s and early 2000s, something that I worked on with many others, some in this room, at the time. It explores in particular how attempts to close down to risk through a so-called science-based approach acted to exclude a whole array of uncertainties that were associated with public concerns, impacts on health, biodiversity, as well as wider questions of control and ownership in the food system. So by looking at policy responses in different countries, the UK, the US, India, South Africa, Brazil are looked at in the chapter, we can see that the focus of regulatory policy cultures highlights how professional, institutional, and cultural perspectives get incorporated into responses to uncertainty. So the contrast, for example, between the so-called precautionary approach that was dominant in the European Union versus an industry-led legalistic approach in the US, focused on the equivalence of GM products, is a case in point. But what we see again and again is that a risk-based, science-focused approach is simply inadequate, along with actually a narrow legalistic approach, which often goes alongside. Instead, policy must make public involvement and deliberation around these variety of uncertainties central to regulatory choices, whether that's in relation to upstream science or downstream implementation policy. The next chapter looks at a different set of questions, but again with some common themes. Critical infrastructures. These are infrastructures that deliver important goods and services to society in the face of high levels of variability. They may be electricity supply systems, for example, or food producing systems. The key question is, how do goods and services, whether it's electricity or food, get delivered reliably? And who's involved? In this chapter, I take the case of the electricity supply system in California, studied by Emery Rowe and colleagues at Berkeley, and a pastoral system in northern Kenya that must respond to drought, disease, conflict, and so on. What's interesting is both operate in really quite similar ways. Both rely heavily on what are called reliability professionals, people who can respond to the immediate day-to-day challenges, but also have an understanding of the wider horizon and intelligence on the wider system. Tracking between these modes is therefore crucial in keeping the lights on in California and keeping the herds alive in Kenya. Such professionals in any infrastructure operate in networks necessarily, linking people across the system. And in both cases, such professionals are massively underappreciated. But responding to uncertainty and avoiding the dangers of surprise through ignorance, such professionals and their networks are absolutely vital and are crucial in rethinking the management of infrastructures in a turbulent world. The next chapter turns to pandemics. Now, of course, as we all know, following COVID, pandemics are a huge source of uncertainty. The chapter looks at obviously COVID-19, but also has reflections on SARS, on avian influenza, which I worked on in the past, and on Ebola. How to respond to pandemics and prepare for them is a massive current policy priority. But the standard response is to rely on epidemiological models and particular technical interventions to try and predict, manage, control. But as we found in the UK and elsewhere during the COVID pandemic, things are very uncertain, not surprisingly. So the chapter moves between different locations, different sites where these issues were debated during COVID-19, the modelling community in the UK, key medical and public health schools that were producing those models, emergency response systems, and two places where the pandemic was being confronted day to day, the UK Midlands and southern Zimbabwe. Again, very different settings, but very different, very similar lessons learned. And the chapter in particular highlights the disconnect between attempts to predict and calculate. In the UK case, it was, as we now know, mistakenly initially focused on influenza models and data. Disconnect between that modeling expertise and the day-to-day response to disease and its implications on the ground, which are, of course, affected by the context and by class and ethnicity, location, gender, age, and so on, which are not captured in any of these models. So through these different experiences, I make the argument for a different approach to pandemic preparedness and response, less reliant on that centralized control approach using epidemiological models and technical interventions, and more on appreciating multiple knowledges and the direct lived experiences of those on the front line, living day to day with disease. Quite a similar argument is made in the chapter on disasters. Earthquakes, floods, droughts and so on seem to always be dominating the news. And there's a huge industry, as you will know, focused on so-called disaster risk reduction and response. The UN Sendai framework, for example, encapsulates this, but this is largely, yet again, focused on managing risk and improving prediction of disasters, rather than thinking about navigating uncertainty. So this chapter moves between these UN discussions from following the UN Sendai framework to thinking about how people manage drought on the ground, in this case, pastoralists in southern Ethiopia. What we find is that these externally imposed and developed technical and financial solutions to managing disaster, early warning, anticipatory action, risk management, de-risking through insurance and so on, are often not articulating with the local conditions on the ground. They're not trusted and often not, and sometimes not used. They don't integrate well with the local experiences of facing multiple intersecting uncertainties. So in conclusion, how do we think about disasters in a different way? A different approach to disaster response and preparedness, one that's more rooted in local capacities, forms of moral economy, solidarities that exist around these events, and the social networks and vernacular understandings of resilience that are essential in thinking about how to respond to disasters in a different way. These themes are again echoed in the final chapter a case study chapter on climate change, perhaps the biggest challenge facing us all. We all know that climate change is happening, but it's uncertain how the impacts will play out, to what extent, where, affecting whom. And again, I look at models and how they act to mutually construct, if you like, a particular set of global policy responses, often ignoring the particular challenges that are found on the ground. The chapter moves from these big IPCC processes, modelling efforts in the UK Met Office, collaborative approaches to global circulation modelling, to two places where climate change is being faced day to day. The Sundarbans in India and Bangladesh, drawing on Lila and others' work, and dryland farming areas in southern Zimbabwe, where I've worked for many years. Here, responses, whether they're Zimbabwean farmers or Indian Delta dwellers, they know full well climate change is happening, but they need to adapt and learn and innovate to survive. So following Sheila Jasanoff, we ask, how at the levels of community, polity, space and time will scientists' impersonal knowledge of the main rhythms of lived lives and the specificities of human experience? A global consensus on the meaning and urgency of climate change cannot arise on the basis of expert consensus alone. So the science of climate change obviously has moved on leaps and bounds over the last decades, but not necessarily caught up with the day-to-day rhythms and practices on the ground, rather like the debate around pandemics or disasters. So to tackle climate change effectively and think about adaptation and mitigation responses, there needs to be a greater commitment to what Sheila calls co-construction. In other words, the joint production of both knowledge and social and political orders through the interaction of scientists, local people, and others in developing solutions from, in Lila and colleagues' terms, from both above and below. So that's the rapid tour of the chapters. You have to read the book to get the full detail. I could give only a schematic example, but the aim of the book was to give a sense that this story touches many settings, touches many policy areas, touches many contexts. This slide makes the case drawing from the different chapters developed later in the book for a move from what I call a risk paradigm to an uncertainty paradigm, from control to care, as we've used those terms in the STEP Centre. Now, I won't go into this table, don't worry, but you can see some of the contrasts here across a whole array of different policy domains, whether we're talking about public administration, whether we're talking about disaster preparedness and humanitarian response, whether we're talking about economic policy. There needs to be, I would argue, a very fundamental paradigm shift in the way we think about these issues. And this has major implications for what we think about development and development studies more broadly. As I've indicated already in the talk, and right across the chapters, we meet a whole variety of different people, whether they're electricity supply engineers in California, pastoralists in Kenya and Ethiopia or China, epidemiological and climate modelers, to small-scale farmers and fishers in Zimbabwe and India, and many more. All of these people, in many ways, have already moved to an uncertainty paradigm by necessity. They live from uncertainty. Now, of course, the conditions through which uncertainties arise are, of course, deeply affected by context, as I've already mentioned. Contrasting histories, experiences of colonialism, policy cultures, and so on. So I'm not saying everyone is the same. I'm saying that everyone is experiencing similar dilemmas, but has to construct new solutions in their own contexts. But in each of these settings and each of the case studies, we observe a contrast between what we would call, following Andy, in the STEP Centre, a contrast between closing down to risk, the top left-hand corner of that diagram, through particularly calculative modelling approaches, but other systems of control, versus opening up to uncertainty through flexible learning and adaptation in the everyday practiced experience of many different people. And despite the variety of contexts, it's a universal challenge, even though there are a variety of different experiences and different solutions. So what does this suggest for a new politics of uncertainty, something that Andy and I wrote about and other people contributed to in an edited book that came out a few years ago? The politics of risk, as we've seen, is very much centered, as I've said, on an approach essentially around calculative technocratic control, where we can assume, we can predict, we can model, we can manage. A politics of uncertainty, by contrast, is much more about socially embedded network learning, flexibility, adaptation, social innovation, often centered on what's been called a politics of care and conviviality. And these are very different forms of politics. The violent politics of closing down versus the more hopeful politics of opening up. Now, of course, this is not a new argument at all. There are many similar arguments going back to the big debates about the risk society, for example, in the 1980s from German sociologists Ulrich Beck and others, for example, from Niklas Luhmann, who argued about changing politics in the face of systemic risks emerging from industrial societies. Indeed, others have thought about the implications of a politics of risk and the need for a new philosophical paradigm for thinking about uncertainty. Pragmatist philosophers from John Dewey through to Richard Rorty have all argued that we may have to grip with what they call practical reasoning, creating what's useful, tangible, with imagination, courage, and virtue. But over the last few decades, I think there has been more and more thinking and more work that pushes us towards what we should understand as an uncertainty paradigm, with major implications for disciplines like development studies, but also innovation studies and policy thinking more generally. And it's emerged from a variety of different disciplinary and philosophical backgrounds. So in contrast to sometimes the glib use of terms like the polycrisis, which, you know, is a discourse that's been well used over the last few years, but has become quickly appropriated, this wider body of work, I think, focuses in particular on a politics of knowledge emerging from intersecting uncertainties and associated crises. It has in turn, I think, fostered a reimagining of a very narrow vision of modernity based on risk, fixity, stability, optimality, and control, moving us towards this paradigm of uncertainty with new relationships with accredited expertise and a new politics of responsibility, accountability, and democracy. So why is escaping the risk paradigm important? And why is it necessary, and particularly necessary now, to argue for this shift? The practice of development, and more broadly, as I've said, economic policy, humanitarian and disaster response, organizational systems for aid delivery, I could go on and on and on, are all trapped, I would argue, in a very particular risk paradigm, and perhaps more so as a consequence of the particular forms of neoliberalization and what Mike Power and others called the audit culture. And this creates a rather dominant, narrow vision of modernity, constructed through this paradigm of control. And the problem is, as I said right at the beginning, it doesn't work. We see the failure of all of these processes in the face of the turbulent challenges of today. So the challenge is to break free, to decolonize, if you like, to rethink, to reimagine, and move towards a new paradigm. The good news is that all is not lost. This book is not one of total despair, which is why, drawing from these field experiences, there are lots of experiences to draw from, as we see across the book. But we can also draw from other periods, other cultures, other sources of inspiration more broadly, thinking how to break out of this modernist trap of the risk paradigm, recasting in many ways how we think about the world, letting go of the banister, as Hannah Arendt called it way back, from the current confines of standard thinking and practice. So where can we seek inspiration? As I've discussed, and as is elaborated in the chapters, there are plenty of people to learn from. These are the people who must, by necessity, live with and from uncertainty. These are the pastoralists we've talked about, but also delta dwellers, fishers, swidden cultivators, small-scale farmers, and so on. But also frontline workers, health workers, agricultural extensionists, control room engineers, disaster relief agency people. This isn't an argument for just indigenous knowledge. This is an argument for diverse knowledges around people who are managing and responding to uncertainty. We can also seek inspiration from our own disciplines and the interactions of those disciplines, often going back into histories of disciplines where over time we've lost some of the thinking that was part of the development of those disciplines. So, for example, in economics, a discipline that is so influential in framing policy, has dominated development studies for many, many years. There are many strands of economics thinking that go beyond a narrow neoclassical view where blackboard proofs and mathematical models, what Milton Friedman called a positive economics. we only have to look at other traditions within economics, and there's a great comic in our Uncertain Worlds exhibition for those of you online that's already displayed in this room, but you can have a look at it. You can have a look at it online, which draws on a world development paper that I did with some colleagues in the States. And there we argue that traditions in economics going back to Frank Knight, to Friedrich von Hayek, from John Maynard Keynes, Alfred Shackle, and of course, the great Albert Hirschman, all were thinking about uncertainty in different ways that have been lost as the developments of a discipline has narrowed and focused to a particular form. I've chosen economics. You could choose chemistry, you could choose biology, you could choose psychology, you could choose many disciplines that have narrowed in this way, moving towards the top left-hand corner of the diagram of prediction and control, away from embracing uncertainty. But there are new approaches in economics, ecological economics, complexity economics, post-Keynesian economics that are doing this now. So I think there is sources of inspiration to reclaim from older debates, but also reinvent for the contemporary era, as those traditions are now doing within economics. So we have to ask, are there other traditions out there that we can draw on for inspiration? And that may need looking beyond a Google search of the latest publications in the last few years. How do we understand complexity and change philosophically is another theme that I think is important for challenging the way we construct the world and think about uncertainty. The linear, stagist view of change that dominates thinking and development, think Walt-Rostow, linear stagist development, modernization theory, and so on, has not always been so. There was a great book published in 1996, I think, called Doctrines of Development, that looked back at the histories of development thinking to the 19th century and before, from the likes of Auguste Comte and others, where cyclicity, regeneration, divergent paths were central to thinking about complexity and change. And this is reflected, not surprisingly, in art and literature, where we can take inspiration from periods from before, which were facing deep uncertainties, when the literature of that time, for example, in Europe and North America in the late 18th and 19th centuries, where risk and uncertainty were central to the novels of the likes of Mary Shelley, of Henry James, James Conrad, Gustave Flaubert, and others. Hazard, fortune, speculation, risk, all central to the narratives of literature of that time, exploring through a relational view how to navigate uncertainty. So rethinking our philosophical standpoints, not relying on a modernist view, but rethinking and reclaiming other ideas from the past can perhaps help us in recasting the way we think about development and change. And of course, there are, beyond the Western intellectual and philosophical canon, diverse religious and cultural views, as well as non-Western literature and poetry and others that emphasize things like impermanence, renewal, plurality, all-encompassing uncertainty, which also indeed exists not only within strands of Buddhist, Hindu, and African religions, but also Christian religions, where ideas of hope and sanctuary are important. So what I'm saying, essentially, is that there are a variety of sources of inspiration that can help us recast, help us reimagine, help us rethink the way we approach the world. And that this is necessary because our current ways of thinking, as we've seen through all those case studies, are just not up to it. And that's actually quite a fundamental challenge. And I hope the book offers some roots to that, because I think it is possible to release ourselves from the strictures of a narrow, risk-based management and control vision, Because as the world grapples with unprecedented turbulence and diverse uncertainties, it's important to seek these alternative inspirations and actively resurface and reclaim ideas for reimagining. I'm going to end with a quote from Rebecca Solnit, who wrote a very nice piece in the New Statesman, I think, earlier this year, who argued against following what she called the cheerleaders of despair and argue for a more hopeful future. Because within uncertainty, multiple paths, multiple options can be opened up. What she says is what motivates us to act is a sense of possibility within uncertainty, that the outcome is not fully determined and our actions may matter in shaping it. If we can recognize that we don't know what will happen, that the future does not yet exist, but is being made in the present, then we can be moved to participate in making the future. This, I think, is the radical and hopeful vision that is required for navigating uncertainty, and what's, I hope I make the case for in the book. So I'll end there with an advert.
Right. So thank you. That was, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. That was amazing. Really amazing presentation, and nice to end with that powerful message of hope. So we're going to open up with questions soon, but I was also asked to serve as discussant. And as we saw, I'm just going to give a few comments. Ian opened with Bruno Latour's quote about the vast oceans of uncertainties and how they shape different facets of contemporary life. And I think this book really shows that, these different facets, and it was really amazing the way it did it. And uncertainty has been a red thread in your work, right from the beginning, where you were starting with pastoralism and critiques of mainstream rangeland practices being too reductionist, and that, you had that volume, Living with Uncertainty, the work on avian flu, and also the STEP Center work, really looking, conceptually pushing the politics of knowledge. But this work is so impressive because it builds on all that, but also takes it really further. So it's not just focusing on agrarian and pastoralist livelihoods, but we look at finance, climate, banking, critical infrastructure, but also debates in economics and philosophy. And what I really liked in the book was that in every chapter, you locate real people, their knowledges, their practices, and you meticulously show the skills and capacities, both individual and collective, that are deployed or not in navigating these complex non-linear systems. And also we see, in most cases, that tremendous policy failure that fails to embrace the dynamics of uncertainty. And most of the time, this negatively affects the poor and vulnerable. We also have the whole world in this book, which is pretty amazing. So you break down divisions across global north and south. We have the responses of bankers and scientists in New York and London, compared with pastoralists and frontline medical practitioners in Zimbabwe and Kenya. And we flip the lens, so we often find that we can learn so much from the realities in Zimbabwe and Kenya because they respond far more appropriately. But then there are also connections. So the professional, Jerry Marshall in California in a control room is responding similarly to Rama Mahmood, a livelihood herder in northern Kenya. So in that sense, that's also really nice, breaking that down. And I like the way the different worlds are brought together. The book is also written in a very accessible way and engages with a compelling story. So it's able to distill a lot of complexities, and it has this very powerful message that we've already heard. So a few comments and questions now. And I think what's also powerful is the consistent tradition of Ian of engaged research, observations to systematically and consistently challenge dominant narratives and practices. So we're in this uncertainty paradigm and world of uncertainty, or this era of polycrisis. I know we don't like that term, but we see these compounded extremes and compounded uncertainties due to climate change, conflict, multiple and overlapping crises. And the book demonstrates how pastoralists, farmers, fishers, etc., are living with and navigating them. But so much research is increasingly showing, also from IDS research, how these uncertainties, these intersecting uncertainties and drivers of change present a kind of radical uncertainty that can push local people to the limits of coping and trigger parts of maladaptation. So this can lead to a profound sense of powerlessness for those whose lives and survival are at the front line of climate change, and also trigger distress diversification. So in a way, all these forms of uncertainties, extreme weather events, market volatility, capitalist forces, extractivism, dispossession, etc., come together. The book looks at all this, but I think there are lots of situations where flexible practices and social networks and relationships that embrace uncertainty also break down. And then there's no past knowledge to build on. There is no repertoire. And there are limits to local knowledge and agency. So we see that in our work with farmers and fishers in the Sundarbans and pastoralists in Western India. And many of them have had enough. So we need to actually ask, yes, they're embracing and navigating these uncertainties, but in doing so, are they coping, are they adapting, or flourishing? And in a way, shouldn't we want everybody in the world to thrive and flourish and not just negotiate, navigate, and cope? So that was my first point. The second is, there are many different, there's a certainty of uncertainty, right? And in a way, the book largely focuses on knowledge uncertainties, not ontological, not electoric, etc. That could be one question, why not looking at all these other forms of variability? Also, those who need to change and adapt their ways are mostly decision makers. Those have power and authority and credited expertise. They're not those at the front line, because we see those at the front line are actually the ones who have that expertise. So it's those experts with credited knowledge that need to embrace these diverse understandings and practices, but they also need to validate and recognize the knowledges and perceptions of those who live with these challenges. But I think a lot of fishers, farmers, marginalized people want certainty too. They don't want to deal with the daily flooding of the Sundarbans. People are used to living with these two tides. But on the other hand, in a way, people also want certainty. So we have to embrace uncertainty. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. And while, the book beautifully looks at different perspectives of rich, poor, men, women, etc., there's an intergenerational perspective, because many youth don't want to be pastoralists. They don't want to do the same livelihoods as their parents. They want more livelihood security, and they don't want to embrace the same uncertainties and skills. So in a way, that is also a bit of a dilemma. And we also have people, we punish people who actually embrace hope and uncertainty. Look at refugees, for example. They embrace the uncertainty of mobility, asylum. They embark on perilous journeys full of hope, but their mobility, their visions are not celebrated. Instead, they're squashed, they're penalized, and they often pay with their lives. Okay. But your book is not about refugees, but still, I'm just telling you a little about, the fact that people often who embrace uncertainty. The book is so amazing with its references. There are 36 pages, so we can all learn from that literature. Amazing engagement across social theory, philosophy, different sectors, disciplines. It's so diverse. So in a way, it's really very, very impressive. At times, as you've also said, it draws a lot on long-standing friends and collaborators. So at times, usual suspects in there, which is to be understood. But maybe, it would be nice to also open it up a little more, especially in terms of some of the quotes. And finally, I think any advice on how we can actually open up and prevent these failures of prediction, risk, and obsession, especially on the part of state actors. Because these modernist tendencies are going to prevail, whether they're in Zimbabwe, India, the EU, the UK, or the USA. We're also living in an era of authoritarianism and populism. And I know you've written a bit about it, but how can we expect these increasingly authoritarian actors to embrace post-normal science, cognitive justice, solidarity, care, conviviality, etc.? So how do we actually open up these models, humanize climate and other forms of modeling to embrace local wisdom, experiences, and knowledge? And I imagine that there's this whole issue of power relations, incumbency, and you also need that capacity to actually reimagine. And there are limits to agency in attempts to reclaim and also radically rethink policies, institutions, and practices. We're also living in a world where rules don't exist anymore. Look at Lebanon, look at Gaza. So I think, in a way, maybe that's another book, but I think that's a major challenge, just in terms of how we embrace all these different practices. But overall, huge congratulations. I think it's the best book you've written. I hope you'll write many more. And I invite the audience to download the book and read it. And I hope it'll be widely read, inspire, educate, and transform, and also obviously have a strong impact on policy and practice. Thank you. So we open up for questions now. I think there's a mic. So let's take 2 or 3, maybe 2 from here, and then we'll move online too. So yes, if you start, and then.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. I have one question. How does uncertainty or the care paradigm translate into the practical policy action, especially in developing countries where structure or maybe certainty are scarce, where risks are not yet managed, but maybe neglected? Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought it was great the move from the risk, the way you showed the move from the risk control paradigm to uncertainty and care. But I was wondering why you landed on the word care. I mean, I guess it can be interpreted in different ways, perhaps from different disciplinary standpoints. It may be construed as being acceptance, when it may be, you may want to be moving towards enabling a range of types of responses to uncertainty. So I was interested to how you landed on the word care.
Want to pick those 2? Anybody else? Yes, Lydia.
Thank you. So I guess my question is whether you think this uncertainty paradigm, I think the way you presented, it's about looking into the future, right? The uncertainty towards the future, what is to come. But my question is whether you have any reflections on how useful it could be to look back and to look at what's behind us. We tend to look back at history and try to find patterns, and I think it's a very linear thinking when we look back and try to find causality between things that happen, make sense of the past. So could this offer us a different way of looking back and be open to different interpretations of what's behind us?
Okay, so let's just have everybody, let's introduce everybody. So that's Lydia from IDS and Stuart Gillespie and Esther from IDS. Okay, brilliant. So if you can introduce yourselves, please. We take one more or a couple more. Yes, please. I think that was
Thank you very much. Charlie Howman, I'm a 3rd year PhD at IDS. I guess my question would be more around kind of more practical implementation. So around that uncertainty and your discussions through the preparation of the book, what appetite or avenues you feel that there might be with donors, with ways in which this is taken forward by policymakers, given we are in this era, especially as Leila mentioned, of risk management and control and in reality where we think this can go. And the second is maybe more light on, I noticed the front cover of your book, and if around the choices of that, what that means, and the kind of the broader message that you would want to give through the front cover. Thank you.
okay, I think you've got a lot there.
I've got lots, and indeed all your incredibly useful comments, Leila. Let me start with the sort of practical implications one, which were the first and last questions or comments. How does this translate? How does this become reality? I mean, in my experience over time, working in a variety of different settings, thinking about pastoral development or humanitarian aid, following drought or small-scale farming and so on, I think that the type of research that we can do that provides provides alternative voices and provides a sense that there are other possibilities can be incredibly empowering, both for people on the ground who are trying to implement things and often failing. I often find and it comes out in the book again and again, it's those sort of middle level managers dash frontline workers dash implementers, people on the ground who know all this stuff. This is not surprising. It's the people, as Lila said in her comments, who are, as it were, through a variety of institutional processes, stuck in the risk and control paradigm. So it's how to break that and how to get knowledge from the ground, even within organizations, to speak to the challenges that are being faced. So often that's about reclaiming experiences from people earlier in their careers. Do you remember when you were? Do you remember how that was happening? Because very often as people move up hierarchies create problematic views of how things should be. And it's often a resort to simplistic models of control and so on. So I think offering alternative knowledges, opening up space for a wider conversation, reclaiming people's own experiences and encouraging that debate within organizations can be incredibly powerful. And I think that's, to some extent, a response to the first question. I should really turn over the question about how perspectives on care versus control to Andy or Saurabh if he's arrived yet. But I'll give it a go myself. This comes from, sort of feminist philosophies around alternative, effective perspectives on how we see the world. So it's not necessarily the care sector in the health sector, for example. It's about how we see multiple visions of the world through a different lens. So it links to ideas of conviviality, of thinking about multiple plural perspectives. And it comes essentially from a tradition of feminist thinking around these debates. And it so happens that care and control slip off the tongue very nicely as alternates in presenting that argument. But it's more than that. I think it's suggestive of a whole array of different perspectives that open up questions about knowledge, about how accountability, about responsibility, about democracy, if you like, about thinking about these things in different ways, and I think can be quite productive. But you're not the first person to ask that question, given the way that care is used in multiple different places. Lydia's question about perspectives on uncertainty in the future and in the past, I think is a really interesting one. To be honest, I haven't thought about it terribly a huge amount. I think uncertainty opens up a perspective on time in general, which is quite different. The open-ended liberal version of modernist time, where we can control the future, is the same version of time that controls our perspectives on the past. Whereas there are different ways of thinking about time that are associated much more with how people engage with temporalities in different settings. And there is a bit on that. But in the book, obviously drawing on work of Barbara Adam and many others who've thought about time, temporality, uncertainty in different ways. And I think that might be a useful way of thinking about histories as well as futures, that we don't close down futures with a very liberal, modernist, masculine, if you like, version of how we see the future, but also see the past. There's lots I can respond to your comments, so let me bring them in bit by bit. Let more
Bit by
people,
bit, sure.
and maybe there are some online.
Anything online, Gary?
Yeah, lots.
Please, yeah. It's okay with you?
Yeah.
Because we have 400 online.
So this is from someone working in civil society and the relationship with donors. Even though donors increasingly speak about complexity, flexibility, and risk sharing, the reality in terms of applications and reports are the complete opposite. There's numbers, frameworks, rigidity, and micromanagement. So I'd very much appreciate some good, simple arguments to convince donors that what they demand is absolutely impossible due to uncertainties.
Well, I think that's a very good comment, more than, it's a comment which I totally agree with, is the rhetoric of adaptation and flexibility and complexity can very often, very quickly disappear into the audit culture of metrics and control and so on. You know, the log frame, which is always supposed to be an open-ended basis for discussion about the future of a project, is never that. It's a system for audit and management. So yes, I'm with you, whoever you are.
How do we proceed with caution in an era of uncertainty and limited resources to allocate to several competing priorities?
But that's a very interesting question. I think sort of allocative decisions in budgets, in decisions about programming, can happen through making a decision about, you know, the cost-benefit analysis of different options, etc., which is a control version of how we think about these choices. Whereas actually, if in practice, if you're learning from the type of people that I talk about in the book, the decisions they're making are on the hoof. They're in real time. They're having to be continuously about taking in new information, about managing uncertainties in a continuous way through a process of learning. And I think that's the way to go about thinking about allocation in this setting, where inevitably you're going to have to deliberate in the context of uncertain knowledge. You're not going to be able to have a simple cost-benefit solution, which is a classic top left-hand corner solution. You're going to have a much more open deliberation about options as they unfold. And inevitably, there are going to be multiple options and multiple pathways, and that may be the best way to go, is not close it down and have a simple solution.
What about the uncertainty of politics? Someone writing from the US. How are politics being conceptualized here in recommending an enlightened and benevolent move towards an uncertainty paradigm?
I'm not going to comment on US politics, but I think this dilemma faces this everywhere. Lila highlighted this challenge in her comments. Is that, you know, at one level, uncertainty can open up. It can open up a space for a future hopeful alternative deliberation about multiple pathways. That's the hopeful version. That's the Rebecca Solnit version, where new forms of solidarity and movement move into that space and create new ideas about the future. That's the democratic, care-orientated vision. But spaces of uncertainty can also be captured by regressive forces and authoritarian and populist forces in particular. So we have to be very aware of the politics of uncertainty. It can go both ways. And we have to think about how, in creating the spaces that open up, that we collectively, actively open up, that we protect them. That we protect them with forms of solidarity, forms of collectivity that allow those spaces to continue to be these progressive options. And that, I think, is a different type of politics. It's a different type of politics that's much more rooted in these forms of collective solidarity that emerge out of deliberating on unknown futures. But as I say, it can cut both ways, and I think the point that Lila raised about the rise of authoritarianism, and particularly a populist form of authoritarianism, can make use of uncertainty as a rhetoric around which to capture space, just as debates about decolonization, for example, have been used in that way.
One more, okay, and then we have a few. Keeping a note.
What is the role of finance and capital in the rise to power of the risk paradigm, and how does your book help us identify and enact alternatives through embracing the inevitability of uncertainty?
Capital can make good use of uncertainty. Look at stock markets, they're all about gambling in uncertain conditions. But capital is always based on control and managing the basis of an economy. So capital has a sort of Janus-faced relationship with risk and uncertainty. And it's not surprising that forms of capitalism have emerged in and around this wider debate about risk and uncertainty. So forms of capitalism associated with de-risking, around what Daniela Gabor calls the Wall Street consensus that exists to de-risk capital, often through state intervention, in order to have a pathway to capital accumulation, is a very, very important dynamic in contemporary capitalism. It doesn't countenance uncertainty. It uses often the state to reduce uncertainty through providing support through these de-risking mechanisms and insurance mechanisms and so on, and prospers through that. So I think the relationship between capital and the uncertainty risk debate is a really, really crucial one, and I'm glad that was raised. It's addressed to some degree in the debate in the chapter on finance and banking, where the financial crash is looked at, whereby a particular form of risk management had propped up a particular form of financialized capital, which failed or began to fail until states bailed out the banks and provided the basis for the maintenance of that sector in the West. So there was a case in point of a whole set of risk management tools, including these models and the associated accords, the Basel Accords for regulating the financial sector, which provided the basis for a particular form of financialized capitalism at that moment, which was very fragile. It was very fragile and suffered as a consequence when it failed.
Great. Let's have another round. So we start. Brian, you wanted to?
I'm Brian Wynn, ex of Lancaster University, but actually from a long time ago, a very close colleague and friend of STEPS and IDS and SPRU as the constituents of STEPS. And so I've worked with Ian and Melissa and Andy and Eric Millstone also at SPRU and in STEPS for a long time.
Very long time, Brian.
Something about age. But actually one period of that getting to know each other was actually when you and Melissa took on the co-directorship of the Global Environmental Change Research Programme of the ESRC. That was about 1990-ish, wasn't it? 1988, 89. Maybe you weren't the first, or you and Melissa weren't the first.
We were the last ones in 1999, but anyway, it's still a very long time ago. It is in the last century.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, other people then, but we got involved in that early on. But I was already visiting quite a few workshops down here in IDS, maybe even in spare room. one which resulted in the book The Lie of the Land.
Yes,
Yeah, Robin.
with Robin Menz, yes.
Robin Menz, that's right, and Melissa edited that. But the thing that was important about that for me, looking back on it now, and you know, this wasn't by design or anything like it's just accident, really, but very fortunate accident, is actually how it brought. Let's call it STS. I don't actually like that title, but Science and Technology Studies. I prefer to call it the sociology of scientific knowledge, and particularly scientific knowledge in public arenas. But that's another story, I guess, for now. But the important thing about that for me was that it did bring together several STS people, myself included, into the development studies anthropological, more directly anthropological frame. And we began to see all sorts of important resonances, not just for academic development, but for engaging with world problems as they existed and as we, those of us like yourselves and Melissa, who were field working in those kind of global sites, were actually encountering in your own fieldwork and so on. And that's actually, it's historically, I think that was actually more important than has yet been recognized, just in terms of the way these things actually move and go. And there was a lot of work going on the part of yourselves and people like Andy here, who you got your PhD in 1990-ish, 91, something like that. But I just wanted to mention that in passing. The other thing I wanted to endorse was those comments which Lila made about your book and this particular piece of work, because it's so incredibly, it's really lucid for a start. It's a very, very clear book. And I think that is really fantastic, given the huge range of the cases that you brought together from all over the globe, north, south, everywhere. Now my challenge, which
So I
actually
think
is,
we need to.
it's corresponding a bit with Lila's as well. It's about, I guess, most directly relates to the disasters chapter. Because I can remember reading the book by Kai Erikson, Everything in Its Path, the Buffalo Creek Dam Disaster, which is about a coal mining community somewhere in the Appalachians in the States, coal mining area, and communities basically controlled by and exploited by completely, absent landlords, owners of the coal mines and of all of the land in that area, because that's what they had rights over to exploit. But the communities themselves, and Erikson described the Buffalo Creek Dam disaster, where a mine, storage dam for liquid waste burst and flooded the whole community. Lots of people killed. But what he was describing was the way in which the disaster of that dam breakage and flooding of the community was already there. And it was there in the community, in the quality, in the way in which that community was not able to respond to that kind of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And there are many, many other cases when you start thinking in that way about the quality of the social relations, which is a central part of your book, and the way in which, talking about care, that reductionist corner of the diagram, quantify everything. How many times has a risk ever been quantified accurately and in an authoritative way? The product of P, probability of the consequence, times the scale of the consequence. It's complete nonsense. And yet it's taken seriously and it's given more and more power. Week by week, day by day. And that's despite the critiques of it, including yours. So My question is really. So,
Okay.
I'm not.
What's the
seeing
answer, Brian?
Hopefulness.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
think-
I'll come back to some of
come
that.
back to
Yeah.
it. So I think this has been raised. So we have, thank you. It's nice to go back and also to ask that question. Annabelle, you, and then somebody from the back.
Okay, try to make it short.
Yeah, if you can be, because it'd be nice to have as many comments.
Okay,
and
okay,
questions.
yeah. So going back to the question and the links with the business and capital and so on. I was going to ask you if you would recommend the same to business, because the kind of response of business to uncertainty. I mean, the other phase of what you were describing is a world of business trying to take more and more control of resources, of technology, and so on, to embrace uncertainty. And so basically, with that, even if I can see, of course, the value of embracing uncertainty in many, many areas, I'm just wondering whether to face this kind of, I mean, Laila mentioned authoritarianism, but also more in general, I mean, the approach of business to uncertainty is take control. I don't think that in any way there, I mean, of course, there are some approaches, some things that are changing in which you can see that they are facing uncertainty in novel ways, but the traditional way of taking control is still there all over the place. So how do we face that with these kind of approaches, thinking about the policies, no, the implications on policy?
We'll take a few more.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's take a few more at the back. Yeah, James, Erica, and then Dominic. Anybody else from the back? Yeah, we take you next.
Thanks, James from IDS. So one thing I wanted to kind of raise is when I love the book, and when I listen to you and Lila talk, but what I hear is this kind of contempt for people who work in policy, and that they're very stupid and don't understand what it's like to deal with uncertainty. And I suppose what I'm asking is, how do we build a case for this without working with those individuals who are generally dealing with far greater levels of uncertainty on a daily basis than those of us who work in academia, and are fully aware that they have to make decisions without adequate evidence? And particularly those mid-level bureaucrats you talk about, I mean, who you've highlighted, you know, they're often in a very unenviable position to try and provide advice in the absence of any real evidence. So how can we work with that community rather than sort of give the impression we think we know better than they do? Thanks.
Great. Erica, then Dominic. Any students also? If we have, yeah, we have some more students if anybody wants to ask.
Okay, I'm Erica from IDS. I'm gonna ask quite a different question, or maybe an opposing question to what James just said. I didn't hear the contempt. What I heard was that you were sort of inviting people to think differently, but also to be different. Like there's a thinking and a being aspect to what you're calling upon. And I wondered, I don't know if you know Inheritance Tracks or listen to it, but I was curious because this book is clearly sort of not a summation, and I haven't read it, but it sounds like it's very much a culmination of long years of thinking, but also engaging with other people in dialogue and conversation and lived experience with other people. And I'm curious what you think, what stands out strongest to you, something you've inherited, somebody else's thinking and approach that you've inherited, that you've brought forward in your work, and what you want people to take forward as they read this. So what you want to pass on. We're not great at international learning and development. So kind of from that standpoint, would like you to say something about what you have, what someone has given you and what you want to pass on.
Some more, two more.
Oh, you can.
Or you want to answer?
No,
Dominic, and then you, and then anybody else also.
We're going to have to close our pass for drinks and stuff.
Hi, Ian. A quick question. It's a little bit left field, so be prepared. I'm wondering if your book and the argument about the risk control versus uncertainty care paradigm, does that give us a framework for a critique of artificial intelligence as it's being pursued by the Silicon Valley tech bros?
Okay. Yeah. Here.
Thank you. I'm Yahya, I'm a student in IDS. I come from the Middle East of Syria, so I have personal years of experience with uncertainty. I've never met anyone who wants to be in uncertainty, and everyone wants to be certain of how they can plan in the future, because uncertainty, to be honest, burns into resources. My other comment is, it's very important for people to be flexible enough to manage uncertainty. This is a very important skill. However, what do you recommend to people, organizations, and entities when they're planning their resources and their finances in order to account for uncertainty?
Good questions. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other students, maybe? Those who've come in this right. Yeah, please. Emilio.
Okay, hello again. I am Emilio. I'm also an IDS student. And Laila made a question that has stuck with me. And it was this question of, in navigating uncertainties, are people coping? Are they flourishing? Or even are they entering new forms of livelihoods that are not necessarily safe or certain in the long run? No. I ask this because on Tuesday there was a presentation on food security, and it showed how people who diversified their livelihood sources towards non-agrarian activities in order maybe to face uncertainties in agrarian market, etc. They had more food security than people in agrarian activities. But at the same time, they say, well, but maybe in the long run, that is undermining food sovereignty, no? So yeah, to what extent can alternatives to uncertainty give more uncertainty in the long run?
Very good question.
Good question.
Okay, I think, do
Yeah,
you want to
let's-
respond to all of them? And then we see how much time we have.
Let me come back to some of these. Let me take those last two because they pick up on some themes that Laila presented on, and I think they're very important. Uncertainty is not necessarily a desirable endpoint. I mean, when I was talking about reliability management, the whole point of reliability management is to reduce variability to a stable outcome that allows people to live without that huge amount of variability. That's what people want. But very often as it were, the modernist systems that exist don't deliver that. So people have to embrace the uncertainty in order to be able to be more certain in their future livelihoods. In that sense, creating reliability, creating resilience is an active process that we need to understand and invest in. So it's not to say that we should celebrate uncertainty full stop. We need to embrace uncertainty and recognize its qualities and its challenges and think about how people can manage it. Not to end up in simple coping, but to end up in a more flourishing alternative. Because too often our development solutions end up in quite the opposite. They suggest, well, you should be a farmer and therefore you should carry on doing that. Not necessarily diversifying. Or you should follow this or that technical paradigm. So in a way, too much development involves control and not enough exploration of alternatives that allow the flourishing to happen. But I do agree with Laila and what you were saying, I think, that there are, or I can't remember who said it, but anyway, but there are particular, actually Brian was saying it, there are particular confluences of crises and forms of variability that result in these uncertainties that can't be responded to through these social networks and ways that exist. My argument is not to say that that's where we should stop. We shouldn't give up there. We should also invest in the capacities to build more effective ways of dealing with these more dramatic shocks. Because the alternatives are forms of maladaptation, are forms of desperate coping, which are not positive for people's well-being and livelihood. But rather than saying, oh, well, let's return to the control paradigm and provide a solution for people, what we should do is we should be investing in and starting from the capabilities that people have for navigating uncertainty and build on them, but recognizing that because climate change is accelerating in the ways it does, because shocks and stresses are compounding and cascading in the way they do, existing practices are not necessarily going to be enough. And that's why I'm not in the position of reifying and glorifying indigenous practice, as some strands of argument do. Yeah, we've got to learn from science. We've got to learn from what other people do in other parts of the world. We've got to build new ways of developing resilience in an increasingly turbulent world. And that's why all the case studies in the book very purposefully have examples from the so-called global north and the global south and mixtures of the two. These are not exclusive experiences of poor people in poor places struggling to survive just through indigenous knowledge. These are universal challenges which have to be confronted. James's point, I don't think through the book there's a contempt for policymakers. There's a challenge to policymakers. In fact, far from contempt, there's plenty of examples in the book where policymakers are doing exactly as Erica said, the mid-level bureaucrat, or you were saying mid-level bureaucrats are continuously having to do that. These are often the so-called reliability professionals who have to manage variability in order to create some level of certainty and supply of resources and so on. So it's actually within policy systems that we've got to look for successes. And there very often are lots of people in policy systems who are, Abbas sitting in front of you has written a whole PhD on this subject, who are collaborating, who are doing interesting things that are creating alternatives to debilitating forms of uncertainty. So we've got to look at them. The problem is the policy frameworks, as we were discussing before, continuously pushes back into that top left-hand corner. So it's not only policymakers have to escape that paradigm, and we have to encourage them to do so, providing arguments and frameworks and ways of thinking that allow them to provide alternatives. And the idea of throwing so many different cases into one book, from finance to technology to this and that, which looks a little bit haphazard, is to say, look, comrades, you're not alone. There are other people who are doing this. You can learn from people who are in a control room. You can learn from people who are in the Sundarbans. And let's do that, because this is something that we all recognize as challenging. And I think these sort of debates are going on in business, almost necessarily going on in business. Whether we had the discussion earlier on capital that constrains this, but within business, which is different to capital, obviously, within business, people are having to do this all the time. And necessarily, the failures that you're talking about in business enterprises that are trying to change the world and make profit at the same time, failures are often exactly the same policy failures that we see in public policy. I mean, there are, and that's why within business systems, we have to look at people who are managing uncertainty in these new ways. But it's definitely not a contempt for policy. It's a rethinking of policy in ways and drawing from policy practices in new and interesting ways. Dominic asked the question, does this apply to artificial intelligence? Absolutely, yes. It's exactly the same arguments apply. And I think we can rethink the way that we are trying to control artificial intelligence through thinking about opening up about how artificial intelligence as a technology or as a set of technologies exists out there in ways that can be more open, emancipatory, and so on. Jack Stilgo at UCL has written lots about this of late. Erica, how can thinking be different? How can we let go of the banisters that Hannah Arendt talks about in ways of rethinking? Brian hinted on this before. This is a culmination of years and years of thinking and work and many, many different field experiences. And the preface goes into some of that and some of that history. Brian produced a paper in 1992 that was published in Global Environmental Change, which I think influenced a lot of us. I read it soon after that, and it resulted in the conversation that resulted in the conference that was actually in the room up there in 1995, 4 even, sometime around there. Anyway, a ridiculously long time ago. But the point is, that was a chance encounter. I had no idea who Brian Wynne was. Actually, I did, because I was involved in anti-nuclear stuff earlier on. But I hadn't encountered all these debates about risk and uncertainty, but it was an encounter across disciplines. He was coming from sociology of science. I was coming from development studies and worked with debates about uncertainty in respect of environmental questions. And there was a meeting of cross disciplines, across institutes, across ways of thinking and being, and so on. And what was possible in those days was to be able to convene events and have a flexible, open-ended discussion about recasting. And I think that event was one of many that we've tried to do over the years. And this book has emerged out of that. What I offer to those in the future, well, read the book and see whether you can find some interesting things, rather like I did out of Brian's article from 1992, because hopefully there will be things that can people pick up. People with a more practical orientation, think about what it means within your own organization. People with a more philosophical orientation, think about how this recasts the way we think about our disciplines. And that, I think, is the way the book is intended to offer a challenge to us all, both practically and conceptually, in rethinking the way we think about the world.
Great, thank you so much. So in 30 years' time, who knows what book there will be,
exactly.
or what it will be, you know, what this will inspire. Many thanks to Ian. It's been a fantastic, fantastic session. Thank you to the online audience. Thanks to all of you. And I understand it carries on, so please stay. We just moved to...
Yeah, sadly not available for the online audience, but for anyone who's here, there are some drinks available at the back, and we're going to introduce a rather fabulous project which involved the production of a series of comics around uncertainty related to the themes that we've been discussing. And once you've got a drink, we'll introduce the comics to you. For those of you online, sorry, but you can see the comics online at the Uncertain Worlds exhibition, which is on the pastres.org website.